My name is Brendan McAtee. I'm one of the Node Research Managers with Natural Hazards Research Australia. We work with a number of different agencies with the idea of understanding those challenges and those knowledge gaps that those agencies have and joining that up with the research to solve those problems. We'll talk a little bit more about this project in a moment. First, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present from First Nations people around Australia. I'm coming here today from the Western Australia. I'm on Whadjuk country of the Noongar Nation. So I'd like to pay my respects to the Noongar folks, as well as any First Nations people who might be joining us today. So this is what we're talking about in the briefing session today. We'll just introduce ourselves. We'll talk a little bit about Natural Hazards Research Australia and how we come to be supporting these kind of projects. A bit about the project background and the objectives of the project, talk about the project outputs that we're looking for, then a bit of detail about the applications itself. So governance and reporting, how do we work with the research sector to get these projects done, a bit more about the expression of interest process, and then there'll be time for questions if you have any. This is myself, so Brendan McAtee, as I mentioned, one of the Node Research Managers, Natural Hazards Research Australia. My colleague George Goddard, one of the other Node Research Managers, will also talk a bit about nature-based solutions today. And we have Jack Coates-Manan from Healthy Land and Water. There's the principal agencies who put this challenge up. So we'll hear a bit about that challenge from the perspective of Healthy Land and Water, and Jack can talk about where that fits with the work that they do. So first, a bit about Natural Hazards Research Australia. So Centre commenced operating in 1st July 2021. What you might know if you've been in this space for a while, so previous cooperative research centres, the Bushfire CRC and the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC, ran their couple of terms, and then Natural Hazards Research Australia was formed as an entity to continue on that role that those CRCs played. So we managed that collection of IP that's been built up over those years of the CRC, as well as working in this space now to do new projects, join those agency challenges up with the research that can solve those problems. So it commenced operating in 2021 with an outlook of 10 years, so $85 million over 10 years to run the centre and fund the kind of projects that we're talking about today. That's from the government, but also a significant partner contribution from our partner agencies like Healthy Land and Water and similar agencies around Australia. So the core objectives of the centre, so protecting human life and minimising harm and suffering, contributing to developing, supporting well-prepared and resilient communities, and investing in that research that translates into action to fulfil those kind of objectives is really what we're about. So this is a little bit about the timeline where we sit at the moment. So for this expression of interest around the reconnecting floodplains to mitigate risk project, call for expression of interest opened on the 26th of July. We're in the yellow pane at the moment, online project briefing, to talk more about the project, give that bit of extra detail and answer any questions that you might have. The due date for the expression of interest is the 6th of September 2024, so we're about halfway from the opening till they're due. The timeline following that, applicants notified of expressions of interest outcomes on the 10th of October. And from there, we work with the successful applicants to put the project proposal together with the aim of kicking that off or having that done and kicking the project off around 6th of December. So that's the timeline we're working to. So we'll talk a little bit more about those details as we get further into the discussion today. So T6A1, that's our label. So for all the projects that we kind of manage, but the more important part is this project is about conserving and reconnecting floodplains to mitigate flood risk. And these are the things that the project is really about. So addressing those key knowledge gaps that exist in the implementation of nature-based flood risk mitigation strategies in the Australian context, and really starting to explore from our natural hazards perspective those nature-based solutions and what they can offer in the mitigation of hazards. So effective and environmentally sensitive flood mitigation alternatives in this place, and ensure a big part of this as well as a meaningful stakeholder involvement and community engagement. And that's a big part of the nature-based solutions that George will talk a little bit about in a bit. And conserving and reconnecting floodplains through nature-based strategies. It's really understanding those shared benefits, being able to describe the increases in biodiversity, water quality, and community well-being, and how do they come together, and how can we put that into a framework that allows us to see where those benefits can be can be achieved. Good. About nature-based solutions in general. So I'll throw to my colleague, George Goddard, and he'll take you through talking a bit about nature-based solutions. And I'm sure a lot of people in the room today are familiar with that space, but we'll set the context for this piece of work. So George, I'll throw over to you.
Thanks so much, Brendan. Excuse the dodgy formatting on this, and I'll try not to speak too long just because looking at who's on the call, I think a lot of people are pretty familiar with nature-based solutions, so I'll try not to embarrass myself too much, but I think it helps just think about this project in the broader context of what's going on in Australia and the world at the moment with regards to nature-based solutions. So I've used one of the diagrams that would be very familiar to a lot of the people on the call in terms of when we're talking about nature-based solutions as having ideally this biodiversity benefit at the same time as addressing societal challenges. Really exciting. There's a lot of excitement and buzz around nature-based solutions generally, and rightfully so. This opportunity, I remember being at a roundtable a while back, just after the Global Biodiversity Convention or the coming Montreal Protocol had been signed, looking at how does Australia step up to address some of those commitments, including restore 30% of all degraded ecosystems by 2030. And one of the people at the table said, how do we get communities to get worried about biodiversity when they're already worried about climate change, they're already worried about mitigation and adaptation, both are worried about cost of living, all of these different components. And I remember it was part of that conversation as well. Nature-based solutions offer the opportunity to actually tackle all of those things at once if done well. And yeah, thinking it in one fell swoop, we can do the right thing in terms of biodiversity, conservation, restoration, address even in some cases some of the climate change mitigation and some of the Paris protocols, and then also not protocols, the agreements. And then on the other hand, also look at a really healthy implementation of the Sendai framework and disaster risk reduction practice. So when we're talking about nature-based solutions here, we acknowledge there's a broad range of different societal benefits and co-benefits, including just all of the great research around what having access to green space has or natural spaces in terms of health, air, water quality, all the rest. But we've obviously got a particular interest in, well, what role can nature-based solutions play in mitigating natural hazard risk and exposure? So that's a particular sort of element we're looking at. And you can see it coming through in a lot of the national frameworks at the moment, so including things like the Second National Action Plan from the National Emergency Management Agency, heavy references to nature-based solutions. We see it coming up in all areas, and a number of adjacent initiatives with nature repair markets and nature-related disclosures coming through. So very exciting, seeing it integrated into multiple strategies. There's a big component of actually, nature-based solutions have always been around, particularly if you talk to different, I would argue, a lot of First Nations communities have been lucky enough to engage with over time. Nature-based solutions have been the go. Care for country is pretty central. And there's that inherent understanding and recognition of the linkage between country and human well-being. Within this one, and more broadly, thinking about, there's obviously a lot of opportunity with nature-based solutions, and that's where, and looking in disaster risk reduction, again, there's another level of that which we have a huge interest in as a centre, as Natural Hazards Research Australia. But noting there are a number of different challenges associated with it, and that includes and not limited to, we think about nature-based solutions, it's often harder to quantify than your traditional grey infrastructure in terms of flood mitigation would be one example. But we do understand from other contexts that there can be measurable benefits, but we still have a lack of data and understanding in many contexts that really inform robust implementation of nature-based solutions. And there are exceptions, but yeah, there's still more need. There's still a great need for research, and some really good stuff going on at the moment, more broadly around floods as well. Generally, there's a lack of standards about how they're implemented, and that can be challenging again because the materials are, it's not predictable material performance. It's complex systems that are often being implemented. A lot of great nature-based solutions are seeing worldwide are community owned and driven, but then availability of tools to really help scale that in a way that also helps prevent maladaptation is another real challenge. And this point around maladaptation is, how do we know there's a real risk we see so many opportunities to nature-based solutions. If we don't have clear understanding when we implement them, there's a huge risk that we support maladaptation. So that could look like either eroded biodiversity because of implementation of inappropriate nature-based solutions, or actually increased disaster risk for communities. So that's just to give you a broad flyer. I don't want to lecture on it too much because you've got a lot of experts in this space in this room, but that's just to try and help highlight the centre's interest in this area and why this is a really exciting project, because it speaks to a lot to what has been recognised more broadly in the literature as a real area of need. I'll hand back to you, Brendan.
Great, thanks for that overview, George. Exactly right. I endorse all the things that you talked about there and apparent on those slides. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about this project. And so George has set the context for all the work around nature-based solutions. Now we'll hear from Jack Coates-Manan, who's from Healthy Land and Water, and he can talk a little bit about where that nature-based solution context that George was talking about, how that why that's important to their agency, and where what the kind of thing they're trying to get out of this kind of project work. So Jack, I'll throw over to you.
Thanks, Brendan and George. So my name's Jack Coates-Manan. So I'm currently working at Healthy Land and Water. So Healthy Land and Water is one of 52 natural resource management organisations in Australia. If you're not familiar with these groups, we're spatially orientated, so we represent a geographic area. Healthy Land and Water covers the area from about Noosa out to the Toowoomba Range down to the Gold Coast in southeast Queensland, and we deliver land and water and biodiversity management across that region through partnerships with state and local government, traditional owners, and private landholders. So why are we interested in natural hazard research? Well, as a landscape scale organisation, we see the benefit in the value of managing natural assets in a way to mitigate natural hazard risks across a range of assets, not only in terms of biodiversity, but also built assets. So for an example of that is obviously floods, but we also do a lot of work within fire under the Queensland Fire and Biodiversity Consortium. So as a bit of context for Southeast Queensland, obviously Southeast Queensland is one of the most has one of the highest variabilities of flow in the world. We regularly experience high magnitude floods that impact built assets and natural assets. So we recognise that while flooding is a natural process, our current exposure to flood risk is strongly linked to past land use change, catchment and urban planning decisions, and potentially climate change moving forward. So we recognise that policy and planning that reflects this highly variable climate and hydrology and some of these historical impacts is critical to increasing community resilience to floods. So we see nature-based solutions or natural flood mitigation strategies as a currently underutilised in our suite of management interventions that we could deploy where they are appropriate. So having said that, we do recognise there, from our experience in Southeast Queensland and with various partner organisations, is that there remains a fairly substantial gap in some key knowledge areas, and also effective confidence and guidance in implementing these sort of strategies in specific catchment areas. What is required for effective implementation of environmental solutions or natural flood mitigation? Well, again, we see the need for a larger evidence base and an increase in confidence in their application, because we want to have certainty about what the likely return of managing the landscape through various mechanisms like floodplain conservation, restoration, or vegetation management within catchments. So I think that's really the key initial question for us is, really the effective implementation of these strategies or solutions requires an understanding of how that given intervention will principally modify the physical characteristics of a flood. So whether it's through conservation of existing riparian vegetation or expansion of riparian vegetation, and that influence on flood characteristics. So we know that vegetation and complexity within river systems in terms of the area of flooded land or floodplains that are connected to the main channel actually influences the height and erosive power of floods by attenuating floodwater downstream. But there's still remains, I guess, limited empirical evidence for that, and limited application of models that can effectively demonstrate that and identify where riparian revegetation is best placed in the landscape, or where floodplain conservation and landscape will achieve the greatest benefit in terms of flood mitigation. So that also requires a good understanding of hydraulic and geomorphic processes within the catchment. So this is an interdisciplinary study that combines obviously physical hydrology and geomorphic process-based understanding of catchments. So that's the physical side of things, but we also recognise that effective implementation of these requires, the impetus is often built around the economic or co-benefit return of this type of work. So we'd like to get a better understanding of how to effectively quantify the economic benefits of these types of management within the landscape, using tools such as avoided costs to support the economic case for floodplain conservation and restoration. There's also a lot of work underway in the research arena at the moment, looking at methods or opportunities to better quantify co-benefits of various management interventions, including biodiversity benefits, social benefits, and community well-being. So we see that as a key component to this initiative, is getting some more evidence and understanding of measuring that and demonstrating the benefit. And then last but not least, we obviously work in very at often quite complex catchments with multiple land tenure, multiple history of land management. So there are context-specific incentives and barriers for communities, industry and government to implement these types of solutions. So we want to be clear-eyed going into this in terms of what those incentives and barriers look like, what lessons we might have learnt already from different case studies or specific catchment areas that we should be aware of, and that we can share that information more broadly. I think the key here, maybe just making the connection between some of the work we're doing in Southeast Queensland. We are implementing a range of riparian rehabilitation works across Southeast Queensland in partnership with water utilities, the state government and local governments. This is an example on the right from the Laidley Creek catchment. So it's quite a significant rehabilitation project, primarily managing water quality within that system, though we are looking to better understand how this type of work may influence flood hydrology within the catchment, so we can be more confident that this type of work is also having a level of influence on flood hydrology, and what level of influence that is, because based on a lot of literature that's already out there, it looks like we need to really get a good sense of what scale we're talking about in terms of the level of either conservation or rehabilitation that is required at the catchment scale to achieve a meaningful benefit in terms of slowing floodwaters and reducing a peak flood height downstream. So we would like to use this as an opportunity to develop the tools to support the identification of where opportunities exist and what the expected benefit of implementation is. Yeah, and I think that's just repeating the point earlier around, obviously with this area, you can see there's extensive agricultural land on either side of the bank there. Often our rehabilitation works are restricted to the riparian buffer. So where are some of those incentives to broaden some of that restoration within a landscape like that to some of those those floodplains that are connected during moderate flows, but are still highly valued for their agricultural land uses. So the Southeast Queensland example, as I said, there's a highly variable climate in Southeast Queensland. That's just the 20-year record of median rainfall across Southeast Queensland. We have catchments in poor condition typically, and we're challenged by the fact that there are ongoing developments on flood-prone land. And this is having an impact on our built and natural assets and also our community. You can see there after the 2022 floods, the level of mud inundated across the Brisbane area, and that's a piece of styrofoam out in Moreton Bay with a seabird on it. When we look at some of the local examples or local research in this area, there is some, but we'd like to see this built on. So the Brisbane flood study in 2018 identified that riparian vegetation used exclusively may not provide extensive flood mitigation benefits. However, if undertaken with other integrated catchment planning components at a catchment scale, including floodplain re-engagement, may achieve flood mitigation benefits. So that's a very broad statement. So we'd like to, we see this research project as filling a lot of knowledge gaps at the local scale, but also, applicable across the East Coast. And then there's another example in the Laidley Creek that, based on hydrological and hydrodynamic modelling, identified that riparian vegetation in the upper catchment can decrease the flood peak and delay the flood height downstream in urban areas. So I think this, reiterating the point here that we, as the Natural Resource Management Organisation, we're partnering with multiple state government agencies and water utilities in water management in the area. So although we see this as a benefit for the NRMs in Australia, we also see, and I think it's recognised, that other agencies will see benefit in some of the outcomes and will be the end users of this research as it is delivered. And I think this, speaks to the broader challenge that we have in catchment management, is that really delivering integrated catchment management requires a partnership approach, because there is no sole management authority or sole organisation that's responsible. Obviously, this needs to be undertaken with a range of organisations that include traditional owners and private landholders. I think that's a bit of a summary. I think at this point, I've got probably lots more to talk about, but yeah, if you have any questions, keen to hear your response to the EOI. Do recognise that the EOI is quite broad at this point. I understand there's a lot of research already underway within Australia. So I think that it'll be a good process to further refine that through the EOI process.
Thanks, Jack. Really appreciate that context. And as we'll see now, and I agree, the EOI is quite broad at the moment, responding to the field is quite broad at the moment, but that's why we've staged it in a couple of ways that we'll talk about to get through that. So what do we want to achieve? So we've heard about the context of nature-based solutions, and now we've heard about how it fits into the work that Healthy Land and Water do. So what do we want to achieve out of this project? If I was going to summarise that purpose there, the purpose of this project to equip communities, governments and industries with improved information and tools to implement nature-based solutions around mitigating flood risk and minimising loss of life and the need for prolonged, expensive community recovery. That's part of, when we look at it from the natural hazards perspective and NHRA, that is the opportunity for nature-based solutions in this space to really provide those tools that George and Jack were talking about that can help in achieving those goals that you see there. Now we'll talk a little bit more about the expression of interest itself, get into the nuts and bolts of that piece. So if we look at the output, so as I mentioned, there's three stages to this expression of interest. The first one is around a critical review. So we've heard from George and from Jack that there's a lot of work internationally and more nationally in this space. So the first part is really the critical review of that literature to understand, okay, what are the things we need to take away and build upon? So the things that all, I guess the points around there that are important. So desktop review of existing hydrodynamic tools used to model flood behaviour under conservation restoration scenarios. And so one point I'd make here is this project is not really about building a new hydrodynamic model or those tools. It's really understanding what exists, how are they used, and how can we use them in our kind of context. Critical desktop review of existing economic tools and methods to quantify flood mitigation benefits of floodplain conservation and restoration. So this is really getting into that. What are those existing methods where we can look at environmental and conservation and restoration benefits and translate those into economic data and those financial kind of outcomes as well as we start to work towards a cost benefit kind of tool in this space. So Natural Hazards Research Australia has a large portfolio of different projects. There's a couple of projects that are working alongside this one. This one's new. These other ones are one of them is getting up and going. The other ones have been around for a little bit of a while, and we encourage people to have a look at those projects and think about how this work might utilize work that those projects are doing and how these kind of projects might work together. Critical desktop review of existing tools and methods to quantify expected environmental and social co-benefits and floodplain conservation and restoration. So again, what are those existing methods for taking those social and conservation restoration benefits and working in that space of putting them together with, how do we understand these in dollar terms? And a review of the incentives and barriers and trade-offs of floodplain restoration and conservation as a mitigation strategy. So yes, we could do this anywhere, but what we're trying to identify here is what methods are there that tell us this is the right place to start to think about implementing these kind of solutions. So that's stage one, is really around the desktop review and looking at those critical reviews of what exists, what are the gaps, what can we use and build upon. Then stage two is really case study applications. So taking that knowledge from the critical reviews and how do we put that into practice? So demonstration of the use of quantitative modelling tools to predict catchment flood characteristics. So this is really more about using existing tools and putting them together and combining those outputs rather than focusing on building a particular model itself. Demonstration of approach to identify where floodplain rehabilitation and reconnection in the riparian vegetation or water-sensitive urban design assets, where this can be effective. And I think then, as we talked about again, so this is working towards those methodologies that will allow us to be able to identify where might these kind of solutions fit and start to give us the benefits that we're after. Development of method for quantifying the economic benefit of restoration implementation across a range of management scenarios. So again, translating those environmental, ecological, biodiversity benefits into economic benefits. And demonstration of the application of a method to quantify expected co-benefits from the implementation of nature-based flood mitigation efforts. So that's really, this is really talking about the things we want to achieve, to understand the current state, what the possibilities are, and then demonstrating the way to move forward and build on the body of work that exists. And then synthesis and research translation. So this is really about, after we've done those, this is about putting that information out to the community so others can use it. So discussion papers and the outcomes of the critical review, discussion paper on incentives and barriers to floodplain conservation and restoration. So first one is critical review tells us the discussion paper of this is nature-based solutions in this field, in this sector. The second one says this is the methods that we can start to use to understand where these kind of solutions might be appropriate, where they'll derive benefits that we're after. Talking about the tools and observations for improvement and modelling outcomes. So how can those new technologies be used? What are those guidelines and those methods look like? And then guidelines to support the utilisation of nature-based solutions for flood mitigation across all those potential users of these kind of approaches. And then three webinars to promote the guidelines and translation products, and you might think of those as aligning to stage 1, 2, and 3. Looking now more at our project management side, so a big part of Natural Hazard Research Australia is making sure that great research gets into the hands of users in an understandable way. So that plain language statement is something we put together to help that translation piece. From a project management perspective, we work on a quarterly basis, so quarterly project reports, at the end an evaluation report, and then as we develop the project plan, we start to talk about those communications outputs, which might be those presentations that we talked about, but there'll be other opportunities for presentations and other communications materials to come out as well. And so that's where NHRA works with the successful applicants to make sure that the project outputs are communicated out in the right way and create that engagement with users. So I'll talk a little bit about just the expression of interest itself, mechanics of that. So this, and I think George and Jack definitely mentioned this, this is a real, in the space, it's really about collaboration. Lots of different organisations and users and beneficiaries of what we're talking about, as well as those folks building the knowledge base. So everybody working together, and that collaborative approach is something that NHRA really likes to see in the expressions of interest that it receives. Really like to enable and facilitate that kind of collaboration, because we believe that's where the good outcomes come from. And so there's a couple of options there that you saw about, how can we start to do that, about embedding researchers and start to think up front, how might this end up getting used? Budget and timeframe. So, excuse me, we've got a window in there where we think this piece of work that we've talked about can fit into. So provide a window there. So we're interested in applicants' thoughts on, what work they should do to solve this challenge and provide the information that we're looking at, and how much that might cost, so we get that value for money element. I think that's important over a period of 36 months. And in terms of assessment of the expressions of interest that we receive, you see the evaluation criteria that we look through, and these are set out in the EOI document. These are equally weighted across each of the 5 for this particular expression of interest, because each of these is really important. So research capability, so it's that understanding of the current context and the history in working in this kind of space. Project approach, so demonstrated that we understand the subject matter, developing a project approach that makes sense, is feasible and robust, is equally as important as the project outcomes and outputs. So we've set some guidelines about what we're expected there, and I think that it's important to make sure that in your applications that the outcomes and outputs match what we're talking about in the expression of interest. We talked about the importance of collaboration in this field, multiple stakeholders. Community engagement is really important. So that history of engaging with the right communities and working in that collaborative space is really important for this one as well. And as you mentioned, the value for money, so that the outcomes out of the work provide that impact for the funds that we're spending on it. So they're equally important across this assessment. In terms of governance and reporting, so you think about the governance, the NHRA will contract with one leading researcher. Collaborations are fine. Putting together a number of different agencies or universities working together is fine. We need to contract with one of those, and then we can provide subcontracting arrangements for the other research providers that are working in that space. The contract is with Natural Hazards Research Australia. When we run our projects, we put together a project management committee, which will have members from NHRA, from the agency involved, in this case, Healthy Land and Water, someone representing the research side, and we'll put those together, and that's the committee that oversees the research to make sure it's going in the right directions. We can also put together sometimes a steering committee, particularly, and it might be something like this where there are a lot of stakeholders who all have an interest in the outcome of this research. Steering committee might be useful as well. And we call regular meetings, project management committee meetings are at least quarterly, depending on the stage of research and decisions that need to be made and those kind of things. From a reporting perspective, so we work collaboratively with the successful applicants to develop the project plan. Once we've done that, we get that signed off through the project management committee, and we're off to go. That project plan has a number of milestones, and so we expect reporting around those delivery of milestones, around the quarterly progress reports, project evaluation reports at the end, And of course, around that reporting mentioned as well, various comms products, which might be stakeholder presentations as we need, so that we're preparing the way for this work to get into the hands of those who need to use it and then put into practice. So that's a summary of the EOI process. You can find all this detail on our website. You can follow that link there. If you go to our website, look at About Us, then you'll find opportunities in that menu, and that'll take you to all the open EOIs at the moment. You can click on that link to get into the details and get the expression of interest submission form. Check out the frequently asked questions and those kind of pieces there. For any questions regarding this EOI, you can email research@naturalhazards.com.au. Couple of notes around submission of expression of interest. They must be prepared on using the Centre's expression of interest submission form and submitted to research@naturalhazards.com.au by the closing time, which for this one is 5 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on Friday, the 6th of September, 2024. So just note that timeline again. So the expression of interest open on the 26th of July. We're at the project briefing on the 13th of August at the moment, so about halfway through the period for which the expressions of interest are open. Due date for expressions of interest, as we just talked about, 6th of December 2024. Over the next month, we'll assess the applications that we get and notify applicants of success and work towards then working with the successful applicants, to co-develop that project proposal and get that ready for moving into operation around the 6th of December 2024. So thank you. That's our overview. You've got the link there again to this project on Natural Hazard Research Australia's website. Now we'll stop there and ask any questions from the floor. And remember also as well, so we collect these frequently asked questions as well, and you can access those via the website. And you can continually check there as people ask those questions during the open bid for the EOI. We collect those in the FAQ piece as well. So thank you. If there's any questions, I haven't checked the chat yet. Is there any questions? I'm just looking there. How many projects will be funded as part of this call? So this is looking for a single project to cover those outputs that we've talked about in there. Happy to talk any more about that.
It's Melissa Parsons from the University of New England. I was just wondering, so there's 4 case studies that were kind of listed here in the EOI, and I was just wondering whether the hydrodynamic models are available for those case studies that you'd like to undertake in this work, because I'm kind of thinking it's going to be a bit hard to do the scenario work implied in stage 2 without some hydrodynamic models that have already been built and are available to use, or are those models proprietary? So it's just wondering how with the 4 case study areas that you've identified, and whether the hydrodynamic models and or the DEMs have been built for those case study areas.
Jack, would I be able to throw to you to talk about existing tools and models in that space, and your feel on what might be new and what might be existing?
Yeah, so I'd say broadly the case study areas, they're not prescriptive. The intent there is to really, I guess the intent is to really understand this sort of work from the perspective of both changes in the physical or the gradients in the physical characteristics of catchments and how they are disturbed. So we're looking for, I guess the general intent of that was to identify, rather than you can apply this sort of work within one catchment, we would like to see a comparative approach taken, so that lessons that we can garner from one catchment or multiple catchments with different either climate characteristics or land use characteristics can be, I guess you can have lessons from each different unique system. So that's the real intent of the case study application within diverse catchments. So, but I don't view that as prescriptive at this point, given that there will be limitations around how advanced hydrological modelling is within some of those catchments, and access to those models that may be proprietary.
So do we know which ones are proprietary and which ones aren't? And because it kind of means that, yeah, that it's really hard to get hold of proprietary models. If so, Brendan's kind of suggested that the idea of the project is not to build new hydrodynamic models, but rather to use existing ones to then do, I call it scenario testing, moving stuff around in catchments and then running floods through it to see what happens, and testing that nature-based solutions type scenarios. So I can't see how you would do that if you don't have a model already other than building one.
So I think that'd be part of the development of the EOI, in terms of scoping that where there has been advances in modelling within a particular catchment area and whether you might need to call on a proprietary model or not. If there's opportunities, you can identify elsewhere. The modelling, there are different approaches that I've seen from overseas that don't necessarily apply detailed hydraulic modelling. So I think as part of that initial work, there is a critical review that really aims to identify the range of models that are currently used for this type of scenario planning work. And I think at that point, that would then inform the case study application. So, but I do recognise that as part of the EOI submission process itself, that there'll have to be some, some more detailed planning from the applicant's perspective in terms of what is available and where the best bang for the buck would come from in terms of advancing modelling within a particular catchment with this test case.
Right, thanks very much. Thank you.
I was just going to pick up on that as well. Some of it would be within the EOI, but also some of this is the project planning approach, right, with the project management committee, and it's the richness of that approach is that ability to have the conversation around what's feasible within the scope and budget and make decisions together to have a shared understanding of what's going to work. There's this initial idea. What I like about this EOI is it has that breadth to it that allows for that co-design component to come in, because there may be components we don't already know about. There may be other unknowns, and then we explore it together to generate that project plan. And that's shared agreement between the centre, the end users, and the researchers. So that's what that mechanism is for as well.
I might add another piece in there as well, I guess, and we might be around language as well. When I think about building models, I think about building them from scratch. I don't necessarily think we need to build them from scratch in here, but work on, how do we develop existing models so that they're, as you were saying, Melissa, descriptive of particular catchments. I'm not sure if that's the same language around building or those kind of things as well. Clearly, there needs to be some work with models, and I guess I echo what George has said there, and I think as well, that's the kind of thing that we can explore in the EOI. What is the best solution for doing that? I think if we got back a bunch of expressions of interest that all said, look, we need to build models, then we'd have to reconsider the way we were thinking about the challenge. Someone has their hands up who's just.
Sorry. Yeah, that's me there. Yep. Just a question on budgeting and in-kind contributions, because I'm guessing there will be both consultancies and people from the research sector from universities applying for this, and I just noticed in the frequently asked questions sections that tenured academics can claim all their time as in kind towards a project. Is that correct? So if a tenured academic who's not, sorry. Go.
Yeah, so there is the opportunity to, and thinking about the bit we talked about around value for money, that balance between the funding needed to do it from NHRA versus input from the university. That kind of balance, and as you just said, that can be in-kind time from an academic. Did that answer your question, or did I miss the point? Sorry.
Yeah, no, just to confirm. So that's that academic who is employed by the university who commits time towards a project without incurring any salary on the project, all that time would be in kind.
Yep, that's certainly an in-kind contribution. Acknowledging that the contribution should be tied to contributions to the work, so that they're aligned with the work that we're doing and their knowledge is flowing into the solution that we're putting forward. Then that's certainly included in in-kind contributions.
Thank you. My name is Animesh, and I am from Murdoch University in WA. And I wanted to ask because it seems like the case study selection is mainly in the eastern part. Eastern part. So I was wondering whether from WA, is there any issue in participating in the call?
Certainly no barriers to WA. So Murdoch, I'm just down the road from Murdoch right now. Putting in a submission here. I think so. There's certainly no barriers from the research perspective. Just got to make sure that the expertise is right, and talking about the subject matter around the kind of catchments that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in terms of subject matter, I have international experience in terms of nature-based solutions. So maybe I'll develop a team with colleagues who has this experience in the locally, but I can provide support in terms of international experience, sharing those experience. And
that sounds great, and we encourage putting together those collaborations to bring all the necessary skills together.
Yeah, I was just we're doing virtually exactly this project already. And so I'm just, one of the challenges we faced early on was the process that you go through to arrive at the solutions. And the first question you need to think about is so we've basically gone for, because we're specifically targeting nature-based solutions for flood mitigation. Our starting point has been looking for those nature-based solutions that we think will most mitigate floods, and then modelling those, and then looking for how we might modify those to get ecological and other benefits. Another approach could be, and we've looked around for land care groups that are putting in riparian vegetation that we might be able to include in our models and that sort of thing. Another approach might be a bit what you were saying then, is taking a catchment where you're already doing a lot of, say, riparian vegetation and other plantings, and then using the ones that have been put in to see what impact they might have on flood mitigation. And so the approach that you take can vary quite a bit. I think it's really important to settle on that before you start. And it wasn't quite clear to me which approach you were taking, because you kind of talked about both a bit.
Thanks, Rosalind. It's a great comment. And that really speaks to the utility of the work, in that, well, we want this to be easily translated and applicable to a real situation. But at the same time, I think at a broader level, I see there is a requirement for maybe some more thorough research synthesis around the efficacy of, say, riparian revegetation, what scale, what location, and what sort of areas within the catchment we would expect to achieve a meaningful outcome, or floodplain conservation and reconnection. So I think, and that's where I think that high-level critical review, that's really aimed at building that a synthesis of available evidence we already have in a useful, that's available for practitioners. And then I think, a lot of the key learnings is when we really start to apply this stuff, which requires quite a lot of expertise, so that we're confident in the claims we're making around the benefits that we can derive from this sort of activity, and ensure that we're not overstating some of those benefits.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the tricky thing. The tricky thing is, do you make flood mitigation your primary goal at the outset, or do you say that, well, obviously we're going to get all these other benefits, so let's design for all of them, which is actually quite tricky if you don't know what your flood mitigation goal is. If you don't achieve your flood mitigation goal through that approach. So do you want to try and maximize flood mitigation, or do you want to try and modify other interventions to get as much flood mitigation as you can? They're two different kind of questions, and I guess we don't have to decide now, but it is really important to decide before you embark on this kind of work.
I think it's really, I love the point, Rosalind, and I think this sort of speaks to, again, where I quite like, the way the team put together the EOI for this one, to sort of enable that time for reflection and actually really sort of honing in on the goals. And where I've seen really robust expressions of interest come in, they've allowed for that flexibility in terms of actually it's a statement of approach. And it's like, well, this is based on what we know now, this is what we'd say, but this is how we look to work with the different stakeholders involved to really understand where that impact will be and what's an appropriate scope. So some of that is the digging down to understand what the real outcomes sought are. And I know that complexity as well, nature-based solutions. So, often I've looked at ones that are amazing examples. So flood mitigation is only as good as the grade, and maybe more expensive, but it offsets itself in other ways. So, but yeah, absolutely, there's that flexibility for that approach. So I know it's not that's not a solid answer, but intentionally so, I would say, just because there's that point of exploration with the project management committee. So
in many of Australia's developed floodplains, there's been a lot of unintentional infrastructure that's resulted in the alienation of the floodplain from the river. And looking at the potential for removal of these flood barriers as a flood storage, I think it's what you're referring to as reconnecting floodplains, that it seems to me that in itself is a very major focus or potential focus of the work, and a major opportunity. And that one of the issues, or many of the issues, are going to come down to kind of legal, policy and institutional constraints to that, because somebody put them there for a good reason, to protect a high-value agriculture, or to build a road, or whatever. It's not and so there's this sort of technical feasibility, and then there's a whole lot of these social impediments or whatever. And I guess I just want a sense from you guys about the proportion of effort that needs to be put into both the technical end of the assessment versus the how might we get a community of practitioners rolling out or accelerating the adoption of these things that are likely to work.
From my perspective, I think this phase of the work is really about producing that information, or those guidelines that might help those stakeholder bodies to think about whether these solutions are appropriate or not, rather than creating those end user or stakeholder groups as part of this project to actually implement the outcomes. I think in our HRA's discussions, we certainly need to think about that translation research and that implementation of research. I think that's, from my perspective, what you're talking about there is kind of sitting at that interface. This project, we want to produce the materials that allow those informed decisions to be made. In a further phase, perhaps, we work in that space that you're kind of talking about, to actually, okay, how do we get people to take and use this stuff,
It's probably going to be the next part of my question. Was, it seems to me that what you're calling translation, or creating a body of professional practice, might be as important for the capability as the technical toolkits.
Yeah, I feel like you're right there, and I think we've kind of, with this project, we've kind of drawn that line.
Yep.
Here's the materials. Then we understand, okay, how do we need to build that community of practice, like you kind of said, around that implementation part.
Yep. Right. Thank you.
Yeah, just adding on that, if in the Southeast Queensland example, there are some examples of local government planning that I have identified natural floodplains as assets to be managed as such. But a lot of the time what I see is this is largely driven by individuals within those organizations rather than, say, a community of practice or sector of people working together.
Thank you, Jack. I see we've probably got, well, I noticed we've gone over time. I think we've got time for one more question. That's Mazia.
Hi, thank you for the time. I was wondering that if the project is more scoped toward the desktop study or the sensing and monitoring could be part of the project which you are interested. And also I have a kind of a feeling that more it is towards a floodplain, or you are still interested on urban catchment and water sensitive urban design as well. These are my two questions.
So I'll talk about the first one. So certainly, as we saw, there's large desktop review to understand state of the field, if you like. Second part, once we're looking to put those, understand the knowledge and put some methods, develop some methods into practice. If you need to, put sensors out to do that kind of thing, then certainly write it up. We want to understand what are the methods to collect the information that we need to be able to make those decisions. If, I wouldn't rule out sensors and those kind of pieces, but I also wouldn't say they're definite. I think this is the area where we'd like to see what methods people think we need to achieve the kind of benefits that we were talking about. Part two, I might throw over to you, Jack, around the urban catchments and so forth, and perhaps Mazzy, you might want to just say that again. I'm sorry, I rambled on a bit.
Actually, I was thinking that it's more about the rivers and the creeks and the floodplains and conservation, or it also you're interested on the urban catchment, water sensitive urban design inclusion, and where are they locations should be in the urban catchment as well.
Yeah, it was included in the EOI, but yeah, I recognize that the scope of that study to include, multiple catchments of various scale and including urban catchments and principles of water sensitive urban design is ambitious. But at the same time, recognize that a lot of these catchments within the East Coast are highly urbanized. And so similar principles can apply within some of those small urbanized catchments. So yeah, I think I'd be if there's a particular strength in small urban catchments, I think there'd still be interest in exploring that as part of the research.
We might call a close to this session here. Thank you everyone for the really interesting questions. Help us think about how we describe the problem. So thank you very much. All these FAQs as well as this webinar will be up on our website if you'd like to revisit it. And you also saw the research at naturalhazards.com.au if you have other questions that we can respond to in the meantime. And we'll put those up into the FAQs as well. So please check those regularly over the next couple of weeks. So thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate you spending the time. It's an interesting topic, and from the questions that we've heard, lots of people are thinking about ways to approach this. So I really appreciate you all bringing your thoughts onto this, and thank you very much. We will call it there.